times must a man look up before he really sees the sky? How many years must one person have before he can hear people cry? How many deaths will it take till he knows that too many people have died? The answer, my friend, is blowing in the wind. The answer is blowing in the wind. The answer, my friend, is blowing in the wind. The answer is blowing in the wind.
Hey Push, Mr. Beamer here. Going to finish up chapter 41, the 1960s. I want to thank Bob Dylan with Blowing in the Wind. Potentially the greatest song of the 1960s, or most memorable. There's so many songs I could have chose. I chose Bob Dylan, Blowing in the Wind. So many events in the mid to late 1960s. And again, we think of the 60s, two biggest events, Vietnam and the Civil Rights Movement. From the previous video, we know that the Civil Rights Act of 1964, huge, gave the federal government the power to end segregation in America. Okay, but there were still issues with voting for African Americans. So in 1964, there were some steps taken to improve voting conditions, and then finally in 1965, there was a great law passed. All right, the poll tax was abolished with the 24th Amendment. I would know that in 1964, so that's a step to make it easier for African Americans to vote. In the summer of '64, many white and blacks from the north went down to Mississippi to the south to promote voter registration for African Americans. However, the result, 3 people were killed, they were beaten, and it showed that people in the South, that many people in the South did not want African Americans to register to vote, and they were going to make it very difficult. Also, another huge event, the next year, 1965, the Selma marches. The movie Selma came out talking about this. MLK Jr. goes down to Selma, Alabama, to get support for voter registration for African Americans, but they were beat by the state troopers, set off by the governor, George Wallace, and it was a terrible thing. But eventually, a few weeks later, the marches do happen. And the point of the Selma marches was to get support for a new Voting Rights Act to allow African Americans the right to vote even more. So after the Selma marches, LBJ, who was a friend to African Americans, responds on national television and said, a famous quote, "And we shall overcome." Okay, he basically said that we are going to pass a Voting Rights Act. We shall overcome was the motto or the anthem, the song for the Civil Rights Movement. And LBJ, by saying these words, showed that he supported the Civil Rights Movement. And it does get past the Voting Rights Act. Highlight this. This basically makes voting much easier and equal for African Americans. The federal government is going to get involved, going to go down to the southern states and protect voting rights for African Americans. Huge law in 1965. This is the climax of the Civil Rights Movement. So in '64, there was the Civil Rights Act, ending segregation and discrimination. In '65, the Voting Rights Act, making voting much easier. After this event, this has changed over time. After this event, the Civil Rights Movement is going to become much more violent in America. All right, some of this violence was attributed to the Black Power movement and the Black Panthers. Now, this is the African American movement around the time of the Voting Rights Act in 1965. African Americans were going to start to go away from nonviolent protests, some of them, and look to be more militant. So anyway, in 1965, there were some race riots. The Watts riots highlight this in Los Angeles, showed racial tension increasing. MLK Jr. was mocked by Malcolm X, another civil rights leader. These two guys did not get along very well early on, and he was very much against King's nonviolence. He was a separatist. He wanted to have whites and blacks separated. But by the end of Malcolm X's life in 1965, he changed his point of view. Okay, eventually he says that we need more compromising stance on black rights. He was starting to become more for nonviolence. In fact, Malcolm X was assassinated in 1965 by his own people, the Nation of Islam, because he changed his views and became more mainstream. Doing Black Power over here, this is the symbol, the fist in the air is a symbol for Black Power. And a group that's somewhat related to them, but they're different, are the Black Panthers. They were a very militant group looking to have violence. A lot of times they clash with police. So the Black Panthers was founded in 1966, more militant African American civil rights group. SNCC leader Stokely Carmichael, I want you to know this name. He basically was a big leader of the Black Power movement. Okay, and he said we should abandon the peaceful demonstrations and promote Black Power. Okay, and basically this scared white Americans. Because blacks now are getting more radical, more militant, and they're looking for political and economic rights. So Black Power, highlight this, emphasized African American distinctiveness. They promoted Afro hairstyles, shedding their white names for new African identities. And so this is the movement in the mid-1960s to promote African American culture. All right, we've already mentioned the Watts riots of 65. 2 years later, even worse riots. Summer of 67, a lot of America was really burning with riots, racial riots. And the worst one was in Detroit, 1967. I think you should know this in APUSH. By 1968, it's a symbolic end of the civil rights movement with the assassination of MLK Jr. in Memphis, Tennessee. And so by 1968, the civil rights movement is over. Okay, the achievements though, voter registration shot up during the 60s. Segregation was ended throughout by 1964 by the Civil Rights Act, and by 1972 finally more Southern black children sat in integrated schools. That's the end of the Civil Rights Movement. Now let's get to the other major event of the 60s, the Vietnam War. So the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution gave LBJ the blank check to escalate the Vietnam War, and escalation happens in 1965. Escalation is a rapid buildup of American troops in Vietnam. And so by the middle of March 1965, when escalation is beginning, Operation Rolling Thunder is created. This is the full name of the American plan in Vietnam. And basically, we're going to do full-scale bombing against North Vietnam. And also, we're going to fight the Viet Cong. Again, the Viet Cong are our enemies in South Vietnam. The United States is supporting South Vietnam, but inside South Vietnam are these communist rebels against America. All right, so I think these numbers are important to keep in mind. This clearly shows escalation. By the end of 1964, we only had 25,000 Americans in Vietnam. 1965, the year after the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, we had a dramatic increase in American troops. And then by 1968, a must-know year. This is a huge year in APUSH. 1968, we had over 500,000 Americans in Vietnam. So these results show escalation in Vietnam. And the reason why, I would say the main cause, why are we in Vietnam, is to contain communism, and it's also because of the domino theory. The domino theory is a theory that if one nation falls to communism, the rest of the region would also fall. So we were afraid that if Vietnam became completely communist, so would Laos, Cambodia, and Thailand. Finally, another problem of the Vietnam War is the national debt increased dramatically because all the spending on military goods. In addition, the Great Society also was expensive in the domestic policy and programs in America, so LBJ does increase the debt dramatically. All right, let's get away from Vietnam for a second. Just want to mention the Six-Day War in 1967. I think there's some importance. This is the Middle Eastern War. Israel is going to attack Egypt, and they do win. They defeat Egypt, and they capture new territory, including the Sinai Peninsula. This is the region between Israel and Egypt. So Israel surprised the Middle Eastern world by being aggressive and getting more land. 6 years later, we're going to have another war between these two countries. So there's conflict in the Middle East. All right, in America then, many Americans are protesting the Vietnam War and also the draft. So the draft is basically people getting caught up to go to fight in the war. And it was very controversial because the wealthier people tended not to be drafted because they could get deferments. And so the wealthy could go to college and not have to go to Vietnam. So this was definitely a rich man's war, a poor man's fight. All right, so how did Americans respond? They burned draft cards. Some went to jail. A lot did go to Canada, actually, to avoid being drafted and going to the Vietnam War. Eventually, these Americans were pardoned later by President Ford, and they were allowed to come back into the United States. But there was a lot of controversy with them. Dubs are people that were for peace. They were against the Vietnam War. Hawks were Americans that supported the war. Lastly, I'll just leave you, Vietnam was the most divisive issue in American history since the Civil War in 1865. Divided America. All right, very important event in Vietnam is the Tet Offensive. We're always looking for turning points, and this is the turning point in Vietnam, the Tet Offensive. So in 1968, there's that year again, the Viet Cong launched 27 simultaneous attacks all over South Vietnam. Again, these are supposed to be peasant guerrilla fighters, but yet they're that sophisticated that they could launch attacks against the United States at the same time. And this was seen on television, some of this, and this shocked Americans. And this is a turning point, the Tet Offensive, because after this event, the American public lost support for the war, and there's even more protests. And this really is the end for LBJ. After the Tet Offensive, he will not run again for president because he was not going to get elected. All right, the Democrats did have Bobby Kennedy as a potential candidate in the 1968 election, and so people were excited because it was JFK's brother, and he was very well known. Another interesting thing, at the end of March 1968, LBJ declares that he would stop sending troops to Vietnam, and that he is not going to run for re-election. This shocked America because LBJ could definitely have run for re-election, but he decided not to because how bad the Vietnam War is going. This photograph is one of the most famous and saddest images of the Vietnam War. This is an American ally, and he is going to shoot and murder this Viet Cong person right in the middle of the street. These images, these photographs, and these things seen on television definitely made more Americans be against the Vietnam War, and it showed the power of the media. We're getting into the election of 1968, and Bobby Kennedy was going to be the Democratic candidate, and loved by the people. He probably would have been elected partially because of JFK's assassination. But unfortunately, Bobby was also assassinated in June of 1968. There's the sad image of him being shot. He also was shot in the head. And so Bobby Kennedy does not become the Democratic candidate. It's Hubert Hugh. Who exactly? And so Bobby Kennedy does not become the next president. Also, another bad event of 1968, the Democratic Convention riots. So, and this is in Chicago, Illinois. The Democrats are going to nominate their presidential candidate. It's supposed to be a great time for the party. But outside the convention, the Chicago police were beating on protesters. This is seen on national television. It was chaos. And so, again, America was falling apart in 1968. It was a tumultuous year of all these bad events of 1968. We had two assassinations, MLK Jr. in April and Bobby Kennedy. The Tet Offensive show we're losing Vietnam, and the riots at the Democratic Convention. Lastly, the Republicans, their candidate was Richard Nixon, former vice president, and his VP candidate was Spiro Agnew. Spiro is my hero, maybe not, but they were the Republican candidates. And there was also a third-party candidate from the South, George Wallace, the very racist former governor of Alabama, and he does get some electoral votes in this election. All right, we got two sections. Quickly go through this victory for Nixon. Nixon does win the election in 1968. It is relatively close, so he does not have a mandate, but I would highlight this. He promised to bring back law and order in America. He is going to crush the counterculture, the protesters. He's going to bring normalcy back to America. Interesting, I mentioned George Wallace was a racist from Alabama. He does win 5 southern states, so he is a third-party candidate, does get some electoral votes. And he had a famous saying, which I don't really agree with. I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. Interesting enough, George Wallace runs again in 1972 election. He is shot, and he changes his mind and said that he was wrong for preaching segregation. All right, finally, the obituary of LBJ, so his record. All right, so LBJ, to his credit, worked hard for civil rights as much as Lincoln did, and a lot of things were passed. The Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, affirmative action to help minorities, the war on poverty as well. So he also helped the poor in America. So again, these are, I think, pretty well thought of attributes of LBJ, but his legacy will always be tarnished because of the Vietnam War. He escalated the Vietnam War. Section is the cultural upheaval of the 1960s. We've already mentioned the Beat generation in the previous chapter. You should know these. These are from the 50s. They were against conformity. They set the stage for the future hippies. There he is. Jack Kerouac wrote On the Road. Need to know him. Allen Ginsberg was a famous beat poet. So beatniks are important. They were the first nonconformists really post-World War II. All right, so the counterculture, highlight this term. This is the group of young people that were against conformity. They experimented with sex, drugs, defiance, and they were called the hippies. They had long hair and loose-fitting clothing. California, Berkeley, this college had many protests against the Vietnam War, especially in the government. And it was also a sexual revolution in the 1960s. A lot more people's views were a lot freer and more open to sexuality. Woodstock, August 1969, kind of capped the end of the decade. It's a 3-day peaceful rock concert, over 400,000 people there, and it really is the symbol of the end of the revolutionary decade of 1960s. There it is, Jimi Hendrix right here. Here he is, one of the greatest guitar players in American history. Let's finish up this section. So, launched in the youthful idealism, many of the cultural revolutions of the 60s sputtered out of violence. Okay, civil rights, again, after the Voting Rights Act, turned more violent. Some of the protests become violent. We'll get to Kent State in 1970 as well. I would highlight this group, Students for a Democratic Society, the SDS. They're the biggest Vietnam protest group of young people, so SDS. Jenny's boyfriend was also part of SDS, not a fan. He was violent. Drug use become popular with much of the hippies. So the last thing we'll leave you with, the upheaval of the 1960s. Why did it happen? Why do we have all these revolutions? 3 reasons. We'll call it the 3 Ps. The youthful population bulge. Again, these are all the baby boomers. They started to grow up in their teenage years, in their 20s, and so there were so many of them. They had power with their numbers. Why else? The upheaval of the protests against against racism and the Vietnam War also caused this revolutionary spirit. The final thing is the prosperity of the economy. Because most people are becoming more middle class and had a little bit more money in education, they're not worried about like starving and finding a job. And so the economic prosperity allowed for more protests in America in the most unique decade in American history, the 1960s.